Welcome to Heroes That Help. Conversations with heroes who respond to disastrous storms, floods, and tornadoes that wreak havoc every year in Missouri. I'm Tom Stever for the Missouri Department of Mental Health. The impact of natural disasters goes beyond damage and personal injury. There is mental suffering among those recovering from disaster related trauma. This compassionate caution from the Missouri Department of Mental Health. Some of the information we discuss in this visual radio series may be distressing or traumatizing for some people. If you need help, we encourage you to reach out to supportive people. There is help available through behavioral health services, including treatment for mental illness and substance use disorders. Today, we're talking with Beckie Gierer, Director of the Office of Disaster Services at the Missouri Department of Mental Health. Beckie, welcome.
Thank you.
Becky, I want to begin today by inquiring how the Department of Mental Health Office of Disaster Services becomes involved. How does that look?
Yeah, that's a great question because we become involved in a couple different ways. Typically, when a disaster happens, we can get a request from the State Emergency Management Agency or the Department of Health and Senior Services, or even DMAT, which is the um, Disaster Medical Assistance Team. But it could come from the governor's office, it could come from a local emergency management, and it could even come from the Red Cross. However, just because we don't receive a request to deploy doesn't mean that our office isn't doing things. So we will be reaching out to our local behavioral health centers in the different counties that have been impacted to really figure out if they are getting requests to go out and assist. And if not, can they be ready in case a request is made? And then we also ask those same provider agencies to check in with their local responding agencies to determine, what if any assistance is really needed.
I mentioned floods, tornadoes, and that sort of thing, but what types of disasters does the Department of Mental Health Office of Disaster Services become involved in?
Yeah, we become involved with all sorts of disasters. It might be a natural disaster like a flood or a tornado. It could also be a man-made event like civil unrest or a mass casualty event. And we have responded to things like civil unrest. The duck boat that happened in Branson in 2018 was a mass casualty event. We've responded to flooding and tornadoes. We've even responded to large complex or apartment fires when many people have been impacted. Any event where we might need to do what we call psychological first aid, if that's needed for the public or the responders, we can deploy to.
Okay, so what does your office do then in a time of disaster?
So we do a lot of different things. It depends on the disaster and the requests coming in, but there's several things that might happen. We coordinate with the disaster behavioral health response for Missouri by working with local and state partners, what we call the VOAD, which are voluntary organizations that are active in disaster, and any really responding partner, whether that's a state or local individual or a non governmental agency, we are going to work with them. If that deployment's been requested, then the Office of Disaster Services is going to coordinate with our local behavioral health partner agency to get trained behavioral health staff ready to deploy to that area that's been impacted. And we may be deploying to the site of the event. We might be deploying to a shelter. It could be a hospital. It's really based on what the event is and where the request is generated from. I should add that that's just a tiny snippet of what we do in disaster times. We also, in 2017, started building what we call a behavioral health strike team, which is a team of trained mental health professionals that we really train them in specialized disaster behavioral health training. And they can deploy anytime there's a disaster as well. And they did deploy in Branson for the first time. And then we deployed them in 2020 to a couple different spots in St. Louis for the pandemic. And our goal is just to be able to have members trained throughout the state to be able to deploy and support the communities they live in, but also those surrounding communities that may need additional support in disaster times. And typically, our members are folks that are employed at local behavioral health providers or their networks, but we hope to expand that For example, we're reaching out to chaplains right now, a chaplaincy program to get chaplains on board and trained to be able to deploy as well. I also wanted to add in disaster times, if it's a federally declared disaster for individual assistance, meaning that the President of the United States has granted that disaster declaration, we can apply for a grant through FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, for crisis counseling services. It's a short-term disaster relief grant that runs for about a year and a half after a disaster happens, that allows us to be able to train up individuals to go out into the impacted communities and provide crisis counseling and make referrals for mental health services to those survivors and responders to the natural and man-made events. They're all about helping disaster survivors understand what it is they're experiencing. There's common stress reactions, and uh, helping them reduce stress and provide emotional support, just helping them learn about what are the disaster recovery options, promoting the use and development of different coping strategies, and connecting them with the agencies who can help in recovery.
Well, thank goodness, Becky, that it could be a long time between disasters, and let's hope that it is. But I'm curious, what does your office keep busy with? What do you do in blue sky times and times when there is no disaster happening?
Yeah, that's a great question because we are always doing something. So during blue sky times, or times when nothing's happening, we're working with our partners, both at state and local level, in planning and preparation for the next disaster. That includes things like hosting or giving or attending trainings. We're writing plans for various types of disasters. We're testing, we're training and exercising those plans that we've written, or making revisions to them as we discover, this isn't going to work, or we need to rethink this. We're also always building relationships with our partners. So we attend a lot of different types of events and meetings and planning and preparation type of activities so that we can continue to build relationships, because you want to know those relationships ahead of time instead of trying to figure out who to contact in the midst of a disaster. We're also working on building our response capacity and just educating anyone that DMH serves, as well as all citizens of Missouri, on the importance of planning for disasters and preparing for the next event. And we do that because we know it's a matter of when, really. When is the next disaster going to happen? It's not if Missouri is going to have another disaster, it's when. And we want to be as prepared as possible. So we're always actively recruiting for members of that behavioral health strike team I talked about. We're training them up. We're working with the Department of Mental Health offices and facilities to offer resources. We're also working with our community providers. We're providing trainings on disaster preparedness and the importance of why do we need to think about behavioral health for our staff. We want people to be thinking about that and planning for what they're going to do to help staff. What's that psychological first aid that they can help staff with in the midst of a disaster? So thinking about that ahead of time.
So, Becky, tell me what is the mental health impact on those people who deploy, those people who respond to disasters?
Yeah, so I think it's important to note that there are common reactions or common stress reactions people have to this event, whether they are a responder or somebody who has personally experienced this. There are typical things that we expect to see or know we might see with responders when they have direct exposure to some sort of negative event, right? So a disaster, and what you see from a disaster and responding to it can have a negative effect on you. There's cumulative stress from seeing what you see, but also hearing what you hear from the survivors' stories. And we know that there's chronic stress that comes with that, that we are approaching strangers and offering help. Some of them may reject our help. We may become overwhelmed by just that depth of grief and sadness that we see out there. It may be hard because we can't take away the pain that others feel, and we can't fix it. And so that can create some stressors for us as well. We're working long hours when we're doing disaster response, and these aren't easy hours. These are difficult environments we're working in. Um, all of that can create excessive stress on us. And so we can see common reactions, but at some point, those reactions, if they last longer than 2 or 4 weeks, somewhere within there, if they're longer than a month, we know that that's when we need to get some help. And so we start seeing things like I might be having some physical reactions that may be trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. I might be having nightmares, or I might be having um, problems where I'm constantly thinking about the disaster itself. I may have some stomach issues, some GI distress. I could feel some really strong negative feelings or emotions. I may be feeling a lot of terror about the situation. I may be having perceived danger or anger or frustration. I may have problems thinking. There could be disorientation or confusion. It could be difficulty making decisions, problems remembering things. I might even start doing things like turning to alcohol or other substances to try to cope with some of these things. I may notice that I'm having conflict with my coworkers or my family members. All of those things are common reactions, but between 2 and 4 weeks, if those things are still going on, then we really start to see an impact on our ability to carry on our daily activities, right? So those reactions may come and go, but if they continue, they impact your ability to just get through the day, get through work, school, your home life. And that's when we know that is concerning and that's time to reach out for assistance. And it's very common to see this happen. Sometimes we just need a little of emotional support, or we just need to really think through what is the stress management, or how can I mitigate this. Or again, if they don't go away after 2 to 4 weeks, it's time to get help. It's time to reach out.
Well, there's a lot that can happen in a time of disaster and following a time of disaster, certainly. So, Becky, how do you recognize when you or others might be needing some relief from or experiencing some emotional distress?
Yeah, by knowing these common reactions and understanding that if those reactions don't go away, or they start really compounding how you get through the day, or what you are experiencing, right? They're getting worse, then that's when we need to get assistance. And I think it's important for us to remember it's okay to not be okay. We all need support from time to time. I've experienced that throughout different responding events that I've gone through, where I've I've found myself, I know this stuff, I live this stuff, common reactions, but I've even experienced this during the 2019 tornado. I definitely was working a lot and starting to have some of these common reactions, and before I knew it, I was trying to think, oh my gosh, this is what's happening, right? Like a week or two into it, I thought, wow, I can't believe I didn't recognize this in myself right away. And so having somebody who's also watching your back is really important with this. Having a coworker who will say, "Hey, Becky, I notice you're really tired and you seem to not be eating very well. Are you doing okay?" That can prompt that conversation or help me understand as well. Oh, maybe I need to take a step back and make sure I'm taking care of myself, especially when I'm not at work, so that I can continue to help during the event.
Yeah, that's important stuff. But I want to talk on a personal basis. Becky, what have you seen among those folks who respond to disasters as far as distress and or mental trauma?
Mhm. Yeah, I think about the 2019 floods and tornadoes. It came through the 2019 tornado came through our hometown, Jefferson City, where a lot of us work. Right, we've got our state emergency management agency. We've got responders, that first responders like EMS, fire. We've got hospital staff. We've got mental health professionals. All sorts of people were responding to that event, and I heard from a lot of them how it was so difficult because it was in our own backyard. So while when a disaster happens, I may deploy to another area, and then when I come home, I'm away from it. in that 2019 event, we couldn't get away from it. We left work where we dealt with it all day, and you would go home and you would drive by where the tornado happened, or it may have impacted your own house and your own family or friends. And so it was, we were seeing that really impact folks, the trauma from that. And we know every disaster is different, just like trauma is different for everyone. You know, trauma is an emotional response to a very terrible event. It might be an accident, it could be an assault, it could be a disaster. And disasters are traumatic events that can cause those mental or physical health consequences. And so understanding that, yeah, I can't get away from this. I've got to figure out what my stress responses are right now and how I'm going to cope to deal with these feelings and thoughts. It's just really difficult, especially when it's in your backyard. And so we heard from a lot of responders who said, we just need to talk. We just need somebody to listen to us and let us kind of debrief from this event. Let us have a moment to really not think about this. Is there something else we can do in our off time to get away from it? And that really stood out to me because because it was in our backyard, it really impacted a lot of folks who maybe could get away from it in other events.
Yeah. Well, how about you yourself, Becky? How have you been personally affected?
Yeah, I my first experience with a disaster was 9/11, and I wasn't personally there, but I was working for an agency that had a lot of responding roles in that, and I heard a lot of the information that others weren't necessarily hearing, and that was my first real experience with feeling the stress reactions. And at that time I had no idea what that was. I wasn't in the disaster world, so to speak. And then many years later, probably 20 years later, I joined disaster services, maybe 15 years later, and started learning about some of this. And I'm like, oh, aha moments, right? Like, this is what I experienced in my life. And then the more I working each disaster, I have had experiences where I have found that, you know what, I just need to debrief from this.
Yeah.
I need to get me some new coping skills. The first one for me was after that was the 2019 tornado. And again, it was in our own backyard, so you couldn't get away from it. And I found that I needed to figure out what I needed to do at that point. Up until that point with responses, I think I had been fine, but for that one, it just hit differently. So I started figuring out, um, which I will tell you, I was a non-believer in meditation before the 2019 tornado. I just always thought,
Mm.
oh, that's not going to work for me. It works for some folks. It's not going to work for me. And it's kind of comical because I'm in mental health, but it just wasn't something that I thought would do it. And it was something I had to do for myself because of the impacts I was experiencing in order to really almost reset every day. So I started doing meditation. I downloaded an app called Calm, CALM, and it's a great app. I don't get any royalties from promoting it, but I really found that these the ability to do guided meditation was something that helped me reset and get through to the next day. And it was almost that stress mitigation for me.
Yeah. Well, again, it's interesting that that even you have experienced feelings of wanting at least to reach out to someone or to be reached out to get help. But to wrap this up, Becky, what would you say to either colleagues or at least folks who respond to disasters? What would you say to them, to those who do need help and maybe are afraid to reach out or just don't know where?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is know you're not alone. Many folks experience those feelings of wanting to talk about it, wanting to reach out to somebody. And we also know at some point the common self-care things we hear, right? Like going for a walk or drinking water or getting enough sleep. At some point, we need to do things beyond that. And it's okay. It's okay to not be okay. We have got to move past that in our lives, realizing that we are helpers and we want to be there to help people. But if we can't take care of ourselves, we're not going to be able to give the appropriate amount of help. And that's kind of what motivates me to continue to take care of myself so that I can help others. Also, if you're not comfortable reaching out to a loved one or a friend or a coworker to talk it through, know that you can call disaster distress helpline, and that's that 800-985-5990. You can call it, you can text it, and there are confidentiality clauses in effect. They won't ask you for identifying information if you want to remain anonymous. They're going to be there to assist you and to listen to you and to help you in any way possible. We also know that you can call the Suicide Lifeline, and that's an 800-273-8255 number. We are moving to 988 for emotional help, and that is a wonderful, wonderful tool for folks out there. And you can also reach out just to your local behavioral health provider. Every county in the state of Missouri has a behavioral health provider that covers it, and there are access crisis intervention phone numbers that you can find on DMH's website that you can call as well. So help is definitely out there, whether that's through a family or a friend, or a phone number. Please, please, please reach out. That's my ploy to, or my plea to you. Uh, and if you're experiencing distress now, maybe just even knowing that's okay, and you can get support.
Some good information, some important information. I appreciate that. Thank you, Beckie Gierer, Director of the Office of Disaster Services at the Missouri Department of Mental Health. Beckie is one of those important heroes that help when disaster strikes. Heroes That Help is brought to you by the Missouri Department of Mental Health and is made possible through the Disaster Response State Grant. Please, if you need help, reach out to supportive people from Missouri Behavioral Health Services or any other mental health professional. But reach out. Join us again when we'll talk with another of our heroes that help. Remember, recovery is possible. I'm Tom Stever.